I want to just take up the point, if we think, or if the Department of Communications thinks community media is unsustainable, I have bad news for you. Actually, our global world is unsustainable. We are living through one of the most profound crises, and it strikes me that it's something that is very, very little discussed in our country and really made issue of. When you consider that the current economic crisis is only second in scale to the global recession and depression of the 1930s, then you may have some idea of what I'm talking about. However, when we combine that with a very deep problem of climate change, which is expected to see millions and millions of people displaced. In fact, just to give you one consequence of climate change, which the United Nations is planning around, they're saying that in the next decade, they are envisaging 50 million new migrants simply because of climate change. Now, these two crises, the economic and the climate change, combined with the food and energy crisis, really present us with what we could call a crisis of civilization. And South Africa is deeply engulfed in this crisis. Now, of course, it is extremely difficult to talk about an economic crisis to a people that has suffered such a devastating social crisis, firstly under apartheid, and now secondly as a consequence of the type of economic policies that followed the democratic transition, which, by the way, let's just consider what the consequences were. What we did see since 1995 is in fact a doubling of unemployment. What we've seen is a worsening of inequality. You may have picked up in the media reports that South Africa has become the most unequal country in the world, overtaking Brazil, and where we have seen deepening of poverty in all sectors of our communities. This is the background to a situation in which a financial crisis that took off in the United States engulfed the entire world, partly because of globalization and the integration of all countries into this global economy. The integration of China, India, Brazil, and others has ensured that no part of the world has been able to be unaffected by this crisis. And of course, South Africa, as Mark mentioned, is no exception. One outstanding figure is the 500,000 job losses that has taken place since the beginning of the recession. By recession, we're really referring to more than 2 quarters of declining economic growth. Now, so far we've had 3 quarters of 3 successive quarters in which the economy has declined and shrunk. From a budget surplus of 1%, we are now looking at a budget deficit of 8%. South Africa, the government, considering how is it going to fund the various projects and programs it has, was forced to issue a $500 million loan in the form of a bond. It just borrowed $253 million additionally from the International Monetary Fund. So the situation is serious. Not only have we lost these 500,000 jobs, but we've had thousands of companies that have gone bankrupt. We've had many people that have been forced really into the absolute margins because they were dependent on the income of those that have recently lost their jobs. In this context, we've got to ask ourselves, what does it mean for us in community media? First of all, I think we need to understand the scale of the crisis. It's not something where we can anticipate in a year or 2 years some sort of recovery. There will be a short economic recovery, but because of the structural imbalances in the global economy, it's going to be short-lived. And if you consider the outcomes of the recent G20 meeting, where nothing of any substance was decided upon which would tackle the root causes of the problem, we are going to see a re-emergence of the financial bubbles that we saw that lie at the heart or at the cutting edge of this crisis. This imbalance in the global economy, really you can be characterized by 3 things very quickly. One is the shift of production from the west to the east. China has become the factory of the world. But China doesn't consume what it produces. It's the West, and particularly the United States, that consumes what China and the rest of the East produce. That's one element of the imbalance. And the United States can only finance its consumption by borrowing. And it borrows from mainly countries like China, etc. So that creates a massive imbalance because it creates a financial system which is extremely unstable. And a financial system with trillions and trillions of dollars in circulation betting on short-term gains and losses in currency markets, in various other types of markets, which many people do not understand. So that's the one imbalance. The second imbalance is really the shift that has taken place in the global economy, where we don't produce, where we don't invest money in production. We don't open new factories, etc., because that's not where the profit is. What has happened is a massive financialization of the global economy. Equally, what I say is of equal significance and relevance for South Africa. So I'm just using the global economy as our backdrop. But this massive financialization of the global economy creates a huge amount of instability. To give you a figure for South Africa, we, because of this, and because of the policies that were introduced, what has occurred has been a situation in which we are extremely dependent on inflows of speculative money into the South African economy. And that is why COSATU is complaining about the Reserve Bank's policies of these high interest rates, because these high interest rates need to attract this money in, because we have the similar imbalance that I'm telling you in the global economy. And the third element of this unbalance is a massive shift of wealth from the poor to the rich, a redistribution of wealth through the workings of this financialization that I'm telling you about. And again, the reference to the growth of inequality in South Africa is an element about that. And we are confronted in community media, one, to get a better understanding of the situation. We've got to be able to tell the story, but not the story that is told in the mainstream media about whether the rand went up or whether it went down, etc. That's irrelevant. What we've got to be telling about, what are the consequences for the mass of people that we are, that represent our constituency. 2, we've got to ask ourselves, what does it mean for our sustainability? Are we going to be able to depend upon government support, advertising, and so on? My perspective suggests that government, given the big budget deficit it has 2 choices. Either it raises taxes to be able to finance this deficit, or it cuts its programs.